Live by Dr. Pat. Leading innovation in fertility excellence.
Have you ever looked at a common, everyday object, maybe, I don't know, something just sitting in your medicine cabinet, and wondered how many completely different lives it's lived before it got there?
Oh, absolutely. Like the hidden history of everyday stuff.
Right. Well, today we are asking a question that genuinely sounds like the plot of some wild geopolitical conspiracy thriller, but I assure you it is entirely grounded in historical fact.
Which is usually the most terrifying kind of history.
It really is. So, here's the question for you to keep in mind today. How does a drug given to literally millions of Allied soldiers in the muddy trenches of World War II to fight malaria end up decades later at the absolute center of a global clandestine female sterilization campaign?
Yeah, it's a massive leap, just a totally jarring pivot.
It is. So today's deep dive is taking us into a pocket of history that is honestly equal parts medical innovation and bioethical catastrophe. And we have a really fascinating stack of sources to unpack for you today.
You really do.
We're looking at this comprehensive medical history text that painstakingly tracks the whole clinical and regulatory trajectory of a chemical compound called quinacrine.
Right, the science side of it.
Exactly. And to give us the actual human reality on the ground, we are pairing that text with a pretty chilling transcript from a 1998 investigative report by 60 Minutes Australia.
Yeah, and if you are picturing this as we go along, the visual journey of this compound is just completely surreal.
Oh, totally.
I mean, we are shifting from the mud of a World War II battlefield in the South Pacific to this highly sterile medical laboratory in South America, and finally and bizarrely, to a leafy, well-to-do suburban basement in North Carolina.
Sounds made up.
It does. But the mission of our deep dive today is to really explore the profound tension between utilitarian global health goals and fundamental human rights. We are going to look closely at how a single chemical compound navigated the absolute extremes of medical innovation and, frankly, ethical oversight.
Exactly. So, to understand how a malaria pill biologically translates to reproductive control, we kind of have to go back to the very beginning.
Right, the origin story.
Yeah. So quinacrine was synthesized way back in 1931 by scientists at the Bayer Corporation in Germany. At the time, they marketed it under names like ateprin and mepicrine.
Basically as a synthetic substitute for quinine, right?
Yes, exactly. And during World War II, this was the go-to oral anti-malarial for soldiers. So if you've ever seen historical photos of troops in the Pacific Theater taking their daily bitter yellow pills, that was often quinacrine.
Yeah, the classic yellow pills.
But eventually, a newer drug called chloroquine came along and largely replaced it, mostly because quinacrine had some mild toxicity issues with long-term use.
Right.
But doctors didn't just throw it away. They kept using it for inflammatory conditions, things like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. But then this crucial, completely accidental pivot happens.
This is where it gets crazy.
It really does. So doctors are treating patients with severe lung issues specifically. Patients who have fluid accumulating in the pleural cavity, which is the space between the lungs and the chest wall.
Just trying to dry up that fluid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they notice something wild. When they inject quinacrine directly into that space, it causes a severe inflammatory response that actually creates dense, fibrous scar tissue.
What's fascinating here is the leap in medical logic that happens next.
Oh, yeah?
So it's the early 1970s. A prominent Chilean gynecologist named Dr. Jamie Zipper observes this very specific scarring property in the lungs, and he thinks, could we harness this localized scarring to block human fallopian tubes?
It's like just weaponize the scar tissue.
Exactly. And he knew that inducing sterility through scarring wasn't a brand new concept. Way back in the 1920s in Germany, doctors had experimented with using carbon dioxide to scar the tubes.
Oh.
Yeah. Which actually led to some horrific mass chemical sterilization experiments during the Nazi regime. But Dr. Zipper believes he can refine the concept. He starts experimenting with quinacrine in rats and rabbits, trying to create a completely operationless sterilization method.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because on a purely biological level, this is wild. It's like discovering that a standard weed killer, if applied precisely to the hinges of a gate, causes the metal to rust shut permanently without damaging the rest of the fence.
That is a great way to visualize it. That's exactly what he was going for.
But how does a chemical taken orally for malaria cause a targeted burn in the reproductive tract? And how on earth did they figure out how to deliver it specifically to the fallopian tubes without just destroying the rest of the body?
Well, it all comes down to how quinacrine interacts with our cellular machinery on a microscopic level. It has this very strong affinity for nucleic acid.
I mean, DNA.
Yes. It binds directly to DNA and RNA. So when it's placed directly into the uterine cavity, it dissolves, chelates the DNA, and drastically disrupts cellular replication in the local epithelial lining of the fallopian tubes.
Whoa.
Which essentially causes a highly localized, sterile chemical burn.
Wait, hold on. Chelating the DNA, let's put that in plain English for a second so we can all picture it. When you say it chelates the DNA, is that like applying molecular handcuffs? Like it's literally locking up the cell's blueprint so it cannot divide and replicate.
Yes, that is exactly it. It freezes the cell's ability to repair itself.
And the sources also mention mucosal sloughing and acute necrosis.
Right?
That's just a very clinical way of saying it, is actively killing the top layer of living tissue so that it sheds off, leaving a raw wound behind, right?
Spot on. It creates a controlled wound. And then, over 6 to 12 weeks, the body naturally tries to heal that burn. It replaces the normal healthy tissue with dense scar tissue and collagenous adhesions. The tubes are permanently blocked.
But to answer my other question, why doesn't this highly toxic process just destroy the entire uterus?
Ah, right. That is a remarkable, honestly lucky quirk of human biology. The uterine endometrium is naturally spared because it contains extremely high concentrations of endogenous zinc.
Wait, really? Zinc?
Yeah. That naturally occurring zinc essentially acts as a shield. It inhibits the quinacrine from binding to the uterine DNA, limiting that severe scarring almost entirely to the tiny openings of the fallopian tubes.
That biological mechanism is staggering. I mean, it's almost too perfect.
It is,
But knowing that a mechanism works in theory is very, very different from safely administering it to a human being.
very different.
And this brings us to what the medical text calls the liquid slurry phase. This is where the trial and error of medical history becomes incredibly dark.
Yeah, it's tough to read.
Before they figured out how to deliver it safely, doctors were basically taking quinacrine powder, suspending it in water or sometimes a lidocaine anesthetic, and pumping this liquid slurry directly into the uterus using a syringe.
Right. Just flushing it in there.
Let me try to reason this out loud. You are taking a liquid and you are pumping it under manual pressure into the uterus, which is a highly vascular space full of blood vessels.
Extremely vascular.
Right. So there is nowhere for that pressurized liquid to go but straight into the bloodstream. It's essentially an accidental intravenous injection, isn't it?
Precisely. And that pressure was the fatal flaw of those early trials. When you introduce a liquid under pressure into the uterine cavity, it doesn't just sit locally at the fallopian tubes.
It goes everywhere.
It goes everywhere. The quinacrine was rapidly absorbed through the endometrial capillaries straight into the patient's systemic blood circulation, hitting the brain almost immediately.
And the results detailed in the text were catastrophic. We're talking severe central nervous system complication,
Cortical excitation, massive convulsions.
toxic psychosis. And there were 3 documented maternal fatalities. One of the most tragic examples occurred in Bangladesh. A public health doctor named Zafrullah Chaudhary injected this liquid slurry into a 28-year-old woman, and she died within 3 minutes.
3 minutes, just unimaginable.
3 minutes. I have to push back here because this is where the utilitarian logic gets very, very hard to stomach. If you are a medical researcher and your experimental liquid slurry literally kills a young woman in 3 minutes, how does the project not immediately get shut down permanently? Why on earth do you keep going?
It is a completely valid question, and, it's one bioethicists still debate today. But to understand the why, we have to look at the terrifying public health context of the era.
Okay, set the scene.
Dr. Zipper was doing this foundational work in 1960s Chile. At that specific time, all contraception was completely illegal.
Wow. All of it.
All of it. Because women had absolutely no safe options to prevent pregnancy, they were resorting to dangerous, clandestine back alley procedures. Septic abortions, meaning abortions that resulted in...
Right, so their solution is the solid pellet phase. They take the drug and press it into 7 tiny dry pellets. Each one is about the size of a grain of rice.
Right.
And they figure out they can insert these pellets through the cervix using a modified standard copper T IUD insertion tube.
Which changes everything. Because it's a solid, the active dose drops dramatically.
It's up to 1,500 milligrams in that dangerous liquid slurry.
Yeah, down to just 252 milligrams in the pellets. And because it's a dry pellet, it releases slowly over hours. totally eliminating those fatal central nervous system spikes.
And suddenly the entire landscape of the procedure shifts. It becomes incredibly simple. You don't need a sterile surgical theater.
You don't need an anesthesiologist. You don't need general anesthesia.
A trained health worker simply pushes a plunger, the pellets are deposited at the top of the uterus, and they slowly dissolve. You do it twice, a month apart, usually handing the patient some standard ibuprofen to keep the quinacrine localized and reduce cramping.
And the failure rate drops to an astonishingly low 1 to 3%.
So you have this pellet that requires no surgeon, no anesthesia, and costs just pennies to produce. On paper, that sounds like a public health dream.
Right, on paper.
But I have a feeling that level of absolute convenience and, frankly, lack of oversight is exactly what made it dangerous. It catches the eye of people who aren't just looking to solve local maternal mortality in Chile, but who are looking for a silver bullet to solve global population growth.
Exactly. The story completely shifts from a scientific research project in South America to an ideological crusade headquartered in a basement in North Carolina.
Enter Dr. Elton Kessel and Dr. Stephen Mumford.
Right. Now, Kessel had actually been involved in early funding for Zipper's research through an organization he founded in the 70s.
Okay.
But later, as mainstream medical bodies started asking more regulatory questions, Kessel and Mumford broke off. They set up their own independent outfit called the Center for Research on Population and Security.
This is where that 60 Minutes Australia transcript becomes truly indispensable. Because the visual the reporter, Tara Brown, paints is just unforgettable.
It's so vivid.
You have these two American doctors in a leafy, affluent, picturesque neighborhood in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They are standing in a suburban basement, and Mumford looks at the camera and says, "We have enough to do about 23,000 cases here in this one box."
23,000 sterilizations in one cardboard box.
They are literally standing there packing tens of thousands of sterilization kits, complete with little instructional videos to ship overseas. I'm trying to wrap my head around the sheer logistics of this.
It's wild.
You can't just mail a box of unapproved experimental drugs to a foreign hospital.
Yeah.
How do two men in a basement orchestrate the sterilization of over 104,000 women across 19 developing nations? Did they bribe customs officials, or were they exploiting some massive loophole in international shipping?
They exploited a massive regulatory blind spot. I mean, before the era of highly digitized, modern pharmaceutical tracking, they just relied on decentralized private networks.
So they just flew under the radar.
Yeah, entirely. They completely bypassed official channels like the World Health Organization or national health ministries. They used private funding to manufacture the raw pellets in Switzerland, legally imported them to the U.S. under the guise of chemical research.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, packaged them in that basement and then mailed them directly, completely free of charge to individual researchers, midwives, and private family planning clinics all over the developing world. Sometimes they were labeled simply as general medical supplies or humanitarian aid.
That is just...
Yeah.
It's terrifying how easy that was.
It is. And their motivation wasn't purely medical. It was rooted in intense neo-Malthusian fears. Mumford was deeply convinced that rapid population growth in the Third World was the single greatest threat to global stability and U.S. national security.
He literally wrote essays claiming that overpopulation was potentially more dangerous than thermonuclear war.
Right. And to fund this massive mailing operation, they turned to conservative, anti-immigration, and environmental organizations.
The text explicitly mentions funding from the Ski Family Foundation, right?
Yes. And key figures associated with FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform.
Okay, we have to pause here for a second because as we're reading through this 60 Minutes transcript, the rhetoric gets incredibly extreme on both sides.
It really does.
On one hand, you have Stephen Mumford claiming that his heroic efforts to save the world from overpopulation are being actively sabotaged by a massive Vatican conspiracy designed to protect Catholic interests.
That's his view, yeah.
And on the other hand,
Yep.
you have human rights activists in the transcript, like Binda Carrot from the All India Women's Association, who are explicitly calling Mumford and Kessel evil racists, accusing them of targeting poor, brown-skinned women simply because they view them as a demographic threat to the Western global order.
It is a very charged environment.
Extremely. So we want to be crystal clear with you. As we go through this, we are not taking sides, and we absolutely aren't endorsing or validating either of these extreme camps. Our job is strictly to report the viewpoints exactly as they exist in these historical sources, because you really need to hear them to understand why this drug became an international powder keg.
It is absolutely vital context because that fierce ideological battleground is exactly what these little medical kits were being parachuted into.
Exactly.
When we follow these boxes out of that North Carolina basement and look at the complex reality on the ground in these developing nations, the clinical environments varied wildly. And frankly, they are shocking.
Walk us through some of them.
Well, for instance, in Vietnam, the Ministry of Health actually coordinated a massive state-sponsored field trial involving nearly 32,000 women.
32,000.
Yeah. And a study based on this trial was published in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet in 1993, and it gave the quinacrine pellet huge scientific credibility globally, reporting very low complication rates.
But how did a massive trial of 32,000 women get approved and published in The Lancet without anyone raising red flags?
Because, on paper, huge sample sizes look incredibly rigorous to reviewers. The data submitted by the Vietnamese officials showed high efficacy and low infection rates.
But what was missing?
What the data didn't show, and what wasn't uncovered until years later, was the coercive nature of how those women were recruited. The science was technically peer-reviewed, but the ethics of the data collection were entirely obscured.
And then in India, it was a completely different story. The quinacrine distribution completely bypassed the government. It was passed around through totally unmonitored private medical networks.
Who's doctor to doctor?
Right. The sources detail a doctor in West Bengal casually admitting to performing 10,000 of these sterilizations himself and actively training lay village health workers, people with zero formal medical degrees, to insert these chemical pellets into women in rural areas.
It's just wild, the lack of oversight.
But perhaps the most jarring on-the-ground reality we read about is from Bangladesh, as documented by the 60 Minutes crew. The reporter goes to a busy clinic in Dhaka, and women are receiving these sterilization pellets in about 15 minutes.
Yeah, the clinic staff literally described the procedure as being just like a shopping trip.
Just like a shopping trip.
They come in from the street, get the pellets inserted, sit for a cup of tea, and go straight back to work.
And the defense of this highly casual practice in Bangladesh is incredibly layered and complex. The reporter interviews Dr. Nazeen Rahman, a local gynecologist who had used quinacrine for 20 years.
And her justification for using an unapproved drug is deeply tied to the severe social vulnerabilities of her patients.
Right. She argues that because Bangladesh is a highly patriarchal, predominantly Muslim society where Islamic law allows a man to marry multiple wives, infertility or the refusal to have more children can be used as grounds for a husband to take another wife or initiate a divorce.
So she sees it as a protective measure.
Exactly. Dr. Rahman passionately defends the drug because it allows a woman to walk into a clinic, get permanently sterilized without a telltale surgical scar, and go home without her husband ever knowing. She views it as a necessary, empowering tool for women to secretly control their fertility and protect their social standing in a society that might otherwise discard them.
But the reporter pushes back on Dr. Rahman, right?
She does. She asks about the looming, very persistent rumors in the medical community that quinacrine might cause cancer, and asks if she tells these vulnerable women about the long-term risks.
And Dr. Rahman's response is chilling.
It is.
Yeah.
She basically says, why would these women worry about getting cancer in 20 years when they are highly likely to die next year in childbirth? She implies they will not live long enough for cancer to matter.
Which is just a bleak way to look at a patient.
So what does this all mean? When a doctor looks at a patient sitting in front of them and decides that a hypothetical cancer risk is irrelevant because the patient's statistical life expectancy is already so dismal, doesn't that strip away their basic humanity?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights the exact danger of parachuting unapproved medical interventions into impoverished, marginalized societies. It forces women into a false choice.
What do you mean?
It essentially says to them, your only options are maternal death from endless, unsupported pregnancies or untested, unapproved chemical sterilization. That isn't a medical choice. That is coercion masquerading as care.
And the illusion of care completely shatters when you look at the bioethical violations detailed in these sources. The justification of saving women from childbirth falls apart entirely when informed consent is erased.
Right, because they weren't always choosing it.
Exactly. Remember that Lancet study in Vietnam?
Yeah.
Well, the Wall Street Journal eventually published a massive expose revealing that 107 Vietnamese factory workers were chemically sterilized with quinacrine during mandatory workplace pelvic exams, completely without their knowledge or consent.
Just horrific. They were told they were getting routine checkups.
In India, human rights documentaries showed impoverished women going into clinics requesting temporary copper-T IUDs so they could space out their pregnancies, only to be permanently chemically sterilized with quinacrine without ever being told the procedure was irreversible.
And furthermore, that 60 Minutes report calling it a cup of tea and a shopping trip drastically minimizes the harsh physical reality for many of these women.
Oh, the pain.
Yes, because transcervical insertion of these pellets was performed without any anesthesia in these rural clinics. The medical text reports that it was frequently excruciatingly painful. Women suffered acute abdominal cramping, severe vaginal burning, and transient syncope.
Wait, transient syncope. That is just a highly detached clinical way of saying these women were fainting from the sheer agony of the procedure, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Fainting from pain.
Wow. It feels like this perfectly encapsulates a massive historical blind spot in gynecological care. This ongoing tendency in Western medicine to prioritize clinical efficiency, or in this case, demographic goals, completely over a woman's physical pain.
Yeah.
As long as it was fast and cheap, the agony was considered an acceptable side effect.
It's a tragic pattern in medical history. And to add to that pain, there was the massive looming shadow of carcinogenicity.
The cancer debate.
Right. The global backlash against Mumford and Kessel really kicked into high gear over this. Early laboratory tests, specifically the Ames bacterial assay, which basically tests if a chemical mutates DNA in a Petri dish, proved that quinacrine acts as a potent mutagen.
Okay, so a red flag.
A huge one. And then the US FDA actually halted all human trials after a 2010 rat study showed a clear dose-related increase in malignant tumors in the uterus and cervix of the test subjects.
But the scientific controversy behind that cancer scare is incredibly nuanced, right? Because the sources show that a lot of scientists felt that study was deeply flawed.
Extremely flawed. Critics of that 2010 FDA rat study, including prominent toxicologists, pointed out severe methodological issues.
Like what?
Well, the researchers gave the rats doses that were up to 35 times the maximum tolerated dose for their body weight.
35 times?
Yeah. Furthermore, they didn't even use the dry pellets that women were receiving. They used a liquid methylcellulose slurry, which is a known tissue irritant that naturally promotes tumors in rodents regardless of the active drug.
Oh, come on.
And on a purely biological level, a rat's uterus undergoes constant, rapid, estrus-driven physical changes. It is widely considered by toxicologists to be an invalid biological surrogate for a human fallopian tube.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Giving a rat 35 times the dose in a known irritant liquid. It's like a scientist taking a Colin indoor houseplant, drowning it in 35 gallons of water every single day, and when the plant inevitably rots and dies, publishing a peer-reviewed paper concluding that water is inherently toxic to all plant life.
That's a perfect comparison. You have completely violated the actual real-world conditions of use.
And the human data actually backs this up. The text notes a massive epidemiological study in Vietnam that tracked women who had received the pellets for years. And they found zero statistically significant increase in cervical, ovarian, or uterine cancers compared to women who got regular IUDs.
The cancer risk was probably negligible.
But honestly, even if the cancer risk was wildly overblown by a flawed rat study, the bioethical crime of forced and uninformed sterilization remains undeniable.
Exactly. The science of the pellet itself might have ultimately been defensible, but the methodology of its clandestine distribution was fatally tainted.
And people had had enough.
They had. The ethical outrage finally brought the legal hammer down globally. In 1998, the Supreme Court of India banned the use of quinacrine entirely.
Wow.
Chile banned it. And in the U.S., the FDA finally issued a formal cease and desist to Mumford and Kessel, officially declaring they were distributing an unapproved, misbranded drug and ordering their North Carolina basement stockpile to be destroyed.
But Mumford's response to the federal government is just pure defiance. Before the federal authorities could physically seize the boxes, he rushed to ship the remaining domestic stockpile out of the United States to his international collaborators, fiercely maintaining his clandestine network to the very end.
He truly believed history would vindicate him. But here is the final, completely bizarre twist in the lifespan of this drug.
It's not over.
Far from it. The basement sterilization crusade essentially dies out under the weight of international bans, but the quinacrine molecule survives. Warren Buffett actually donated $2 million at one point to revive standardized, highly ethical research on it.
Wait, Warren Buffett, the investor?
Yes, and today the drug is finding new life in completely unrelated fields of modern medicine. Because of that unique way it binds to cellular proteins and nucleic acids, researchers are currently exploring it as a treatment for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the fatal prion brain disorder.
That is incredible.
It's being championed as a potential orphan drug for severe drug-resistant Giardia infections in the gut, and it's being heavily studied for lupus management. This raises an important question. Can a chemical compound ever truly be separated from its historical baggage?
Yeah, can you just wipe the slate clean?
The molecule itself isn't inherently evil, but its legacy is deeply, perhaps permanently, scarred by the humans who wielded it.
It is a wild paradox to reflect on. A drug that caused international human rights scandals, that triggered outrage from human rights groups, and was banned by Supreme Courts, is now being meticulously, ethically studied in modern labs to save people from fatal brain diseases.
It's been quite a journey.
We've unpacked an incredible one today, from a World War II anti-malarial pill keeping soldiers alive, to a basement-funded global sterilization crusade, to a banned regulatory pariah, and finally to a modern therapeutic hope for complex, rare diseases.
History never really stops, does it?
Never. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We live in an era right now of DIY biohacking, open source medicine, and AI-driven drug discovery. The barrier to entry for medical chemistry is lower today than it has ever been in human history.
That's a good point.
How long before a new group of rogue idealists decides they have found a cheap, easy medical solution to a pressing global crisis, and decides to mass distribute it to the developing world entirely outside of official channels?
It could happen tomorrow.
Will we have the global oversight and tracking infrastructure to stop the next iteration of the Chapel Hill basement? Or will modern technology, decentralization, and the dark web make it absolutely impossible to regulate? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you're handed, look closer at the history of the medicine you take for granted, and never forget the incredibly fine line between medical innovation and human exploitation.
Leading innovation, fertility, excellence. Live by Dr. Pat. Leading innovation in fertility excellence.